Well, hi there. Let me ask you a question. What comes to mind if I ask you what a typical Native American house or structure looked like in North America prior to the 1900s? I bet you it might look something like this, or even maybe something like this. Well, if you pictured either of the two examples that I just put up, you are 100% correct. Well, at least you would be if I had asked you for examples specifically from the American Southwest and the Great Plains, and from two very particular points in time. But I bet you if you were one of the literally tens of people that watch this channel, then you might have noticed that this was probably a trick question, as it is anytime I ask what is a typical Native American example of something. And that's because despite these examples that we just showed being very real and very typical for their respective areas, at least at some point in time, neither of these examples of typical Native American architecture were really present, much less common or typical in any of the Pacific Northwest. In fact, archaeological reconstructions and popular depictions of Viking longhouses and Viking villages from shows like Vikings or Valhalla, or a lot of them that take place in the Viking era, actually show much more similar architecture to what we find here in the Pacific Northwest than any of the typical, quote, Native American examples that we showed previously. Now, while it's certainly amazing that Hollywood and popular depictions of Viking age longhouses and villages do a better job of depicting what villages and architecture in the coastal and other parts of the Pacific Northwest actually looked like, these Viking depictions actually do a poor job of representing the scale of architecture that we see archaeologically and historically in the Pacific Northwest. So, for example, one of the largest Viking longhouses measured approximately 7 by 70 meters. So something like 23, 24 feet by 230 feet, give or take. Now, that turns into something like 6,000 square feet of living space, which is a pretty gigantic house, especially considering that in Beaverton, Oregon, where we are located, the average house is something like 14 to 1,600 square feet. So keep that in mind that that's a relatively large Viking longhouse. Now, a comparison is a site called the Quetzalcoatl site, which is near Portland, Oregon. One of the larger houses ever excavated archaeologically in the region, but not the largest, mind you. This conservatively came in at about 12 meters by 110 meters long. Something like 40 feet wide, 350 feet long. And in terms of square footage, this is something like 14 to 16,000 square feet. And so again, that means that for comparison, one of the largest Viking longhouses of somewhat comparable age to this is almost 1/3 the size. Of course, the largest houses, like the largest Viking longhouse and the largest house at Quetzalcoatl, were far from normal. The vast majority of people would have lived in much more modest dwellings. Regardless, though, every time that I have taught about architecture of the Pacific Northwest, either to incoming professionals, students, lay people, whatever, they are almost in complete disbelief when they hear about the scale and size of architecture in the region. But this disbelief and amazement should be expected. In fact, we have a long history of disbelief and amazement when it comes to the architecture of the Pacific Northwest. In fact, the earliest Spanish, Russian explorers, traders write about how they had to go pay homeowners to allow them to carefully measure and document individual building elements like support beams and roofs and what have you, because they didn't think anyone back home would believe that they had seen something of this scale in this part of the world. Okay, but enough with some of the introductory stuff. Let's get into the meat of the issue and get to talking about architecture in the Pacific Northwest. let's first go into some of the basic styles. Overall, if you think about our houses today, they at a broad level are basically squares or rectangles. In terms of, coarse shape, there's basically 3 to 5 main styles and seen in the Pacific Northwest, and those just have to do with kind of how boxy and square a house is versus how long and rectangular a house is. All houses were effectively ranch style, meaning that even though they had attics and cellars or basements, what have you, in some cases, there wasn't really a building tradition as far as we've discovered so far of making like multi-storied houses, at least not common in any way. Another major variation that we see is that in the long rectangular ones, you would either see that be kind of one big open concept layout, or it would almost be like an apartment building where the structure itself would be one giant structure, but within that, it would be divided up into a series of sort of individual apartments for different families. So in addition to these sort of general layouts, long rectangular, square stumpy, you would also see other varieties where some would have built-in planks for like a porch. There are certain styles that were quite famous on the west coast of Vancouver Island for kind of being half built off a cliff and having support beams hold them up so that you would have this big kind of porch overlooking the ocean with just a sheer drop of a cliff down below you. One of the key differentiators of architectural styles that we see in the Pacific Northwest is one is built with incredibly large support beams on, you'd get these corner and side posts, that quite huge trees, and they would be lined up to the sides. And then you would get smaller sort of non-weight bearing studs and stuff like that in between these, and you get planking lined on the sides of those. In terms of roofing construction, you would also get these huge gargantuan logs. In some cases, this large log acting as a roof, as you can see here, and this would hold the beams and whatnot. Another style that people did was you would kind of cobble together a lot more of smaller materials to create scaffolding, as you can see in this picture that I'm showing you here. So instead of having these massive support logs that are acting as all this weight bearing and stuff like that, you would get kind of this little scaffolding of smaller logs that would line the walls and that you could slide planks into them. And then these would be held up on the roof by a series of smaller support posts. So as you can see, there's huge variation even in just getting that same basic long rectangle layout. On the interior, people would build a series of built-ins that are called benches. And they're called that because they basically look like benches. But what you'd see is a series of benches lining the walls. These would form almost like a step-like pattern. And on these benches, they would often be made so they could be opened and closed. And that's where you would have storage for people's stuff in the house when they weren't using it. And in addition to these benches as used for storage, and again, open them up, put stuff inside, they would be built into the wall. What you'd see is large kind of flat, big benches, and these would be sleeping platforms. And they're basically the frame for beds that ran along the sides of the house. And so when used for sleeping, of course, they'd be covered with soft things for blankets. The center of the house would usually, although not always, the center or the center line of the house would have the main large fireplaces or fire pits for the large fires. And then you would see smaller little fireplaces and what to the sides as needed for warmth or just a particular task that you needed to heat something for if you were doing work in the house. So in addition to the bedding, the built-in storage features, and the rafters, which would have additional storage like in an attic and whatnot in the house, one of the things that I really want to emphasize is the incredible amount of effort that went into aesthetic design for the interiors and exteriors of houses. And what I mean by that is that as you would enter, especially in a relatively well-to-do or fancy or wealthy household, you would find all sorts of elaborate carvings, paintings all over the house. you'd get these really intricate carvings of these huge support posts for the house, and they might be carved in all sorts of different kind of abstract geometric features and animals and spirits. You would also see paintings, so there'd be vivid colors. In many cases, the whole front facade of the house would be elaborately painted. You might even see carvings hung from the ceiling to denote ancestral connections. I really want to put forward that this is not purely a utilitarian space, but it was very common to see very elaborate carvings and decoration, especially of wealthy families, that would take an enormous amount of time, skill, and effort to produce. These took specialist labor, people with sophisticated carving skills to produce these pieces of art and decorate the interiors of houses like this. So, as I said in the beginning, is the scale, the size of these things is just really not appreciated or understood, even by people who are professional archaeologists in the region. So, let's talk numbers, because I think this will really help put in perspective some of the things I've been talking about, and some of the amazing monumental scale will be easier to appreciate. The largest houses ever recorded archaeologically and historically, at least to my knowledge, are a site called the Cathopodal site, which is located in Washington. It is near Portland, Oregon. It's a Chinookan village that goes back almost 1,000 years and actually was visited by Lewis and Clark in their expedition. The second is located near the Puget Sound area outside of Seattle. And the third is located in the Fraser Delta. The Cathopodal site is best attested to archaeologically, while the other two are mostly known through historic record. At the Cathopodal site, what we have are archaeological remnants of a house that was up to 110 meters long and 15 meters wide. And that gives you about 1,650 square meters, or a staggering 17,760 square feet of interior space, which is just gargantuan. The second example is called the Old Man House, which I don't know why it's called the Old Man House off the top of my head. I will look that up for another episode. But this is located outside of Seattle in the Puget Sound area. And that gives us an estimate of approximately 160 meters long by 18 meters wide for around 31,000 square feet of interior space, or 2,880 square meters. Now, the last example, the next largest house that I'm aware of ever recorded, is called the Simon Fraser House, and this is located outside of Vancouver, British Columbia, in the Fraser Delta. And this was a staggering 192 by 18 meters. So 192 meters long, 18 meters wide, 3,456 square meters, or 37,000 square feet. Just to put that in perspective, and a football field is 47,000 square feet. So what you have, the maximal size of a football field, could almost be played inside of this one house. So again, just if you can picture that, we can start thinking about the staggering scale of some of these constructions. And again, the Cathopodal house goes back almost 1,000 years. So this is not some sort of like relatively recent phenomena. There's an ancient history of monumental construction like this. But the largest examples, very cool, but by no means do they represent the normal house size in the Pacific Northwest. In general, houses were far, far smaller. And the average size of houses varied dramatically throughout the Pacific Northwest, depending on the kind of wood available, the kinds of trees, the amount of open space, what kind of terrain you were on, steep cliffs versus open fields stuff. So take that into consideration when I'm about to go over some of the average numbers. In general, small houses throughout the Pacific Northwest were usually around 6 meters wide, 10 meters long, so 600 square feet, give or take. These would be small, not as well-off families, oftentimes maybe relatively poor families in houses this size. Medium houses are going to range between, 12 meters to 18 meters long and 10 to 15 meters wide. And these would usually be on average about 1,300 to 3,000 square feet of space. And so if you can think of sort of like a middle class of houses rounding out that range. And then large houses, again, not the extreme examples I just cited, but just large houses vary dramatically. These are between 12 to 20 meters wide and 30 to 50 meters long. The average-ish range from my calculations are about 4,000 to 6,000 square feet. That's really big. But again, we see those extreme examples, and there are examples bigger than 6,000 in between that like 6,000 to 18,000 range. But I'm just talking about sort of your like normal big houses. But we really want to put this in perspective, and that means breaking down just how much work and how much lumber it takes to build these gargantuan, even teeny tiny square houses, because it's probably a lot more than you think, especially with technology available even to Europeans and Americans and professional industrialized loggers during the 1800s. Just to construct the basic frame of some of the houses that I was talking about, imagine you have a tree that's 60 feet tall and 5-foot diameter. You chop that all up into a series of boards. You would have to fully harvest 20 of these trees. And in the cases of some of the not super scale ones, but in some of the cases of large houses, we're talking about 300 trees. And that's assuming that you got 100% of the boards out of these. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're in the Pacific Northwest. The whole place is covered in trees. Oh, but the chopping the trees down is surprisingly the easy part. Now, how did people get these huge trees to where they were chopped down, to where they needed to go? And this is something that we have effectively no information about because it was not recorded historically, and no one has really taken this up as an archaeological question for Native American logging industry. How did they do it? What did they do? How did they get the literally millions upon millions of board feet of lumber from these giant trees down to where they needed to go? And I'm telling you this because individual pieces of ridge support beams, like we're showing here, and these support posts, these big, massive weight-bearing posts shown here, these could weigh between 3 and 6 tons a piece. And these could be more than 40 meters long, 140 feet long. And so you're talking about individual elements weighing literal tons got from where they were chopped down all the way to the house. And we have precious little information historically about how this was achieved, just little tidbits here and there. And it is an open question that archaeologists desperately need to work on. And it's something we're trying to put together research project here. But that's not the point. The point is we don't know how the logging industry worked, but we know it had to be a logging industry because we know how logging in the 1800s for Europeans and European Americans worked in the Pacific Northwest, and they had steel tools. Some of the larger trees in the Pacific Northwest, it would take entire teams upwards of a week to fell one. Now, in some cases, they even resorted to using dynamite to blow down the tree. And I'll tell you, the scale of infrastructure they needed to support a logging industry was gargantuan. Imagine what the native industry must have looked like in terms of labor. That's why you get whole logging towns and little villages that spotted up across the Pacific Northwest, because the amount of labor that you needed to effectively exploit all these trees and get this lumber was enormous, and you had to feed them, take care of them, give them shelter. Think about that investment and getting these people, again, with steel tools and in some cases mechanized equipment and huge financing from corporations to create this infrastructure to move logs to where they needed to go. And just think about the amount of organizational effort it would take to make all these people work together and get logs moving correctly. Why I want to bring this up is that was what the logging industry looked like in the late 1800s. To simply transport large trees that we're talking about to where they needed to go. So think about what must have had to exist for a native industry which needed to supply hundreds of villages of wood just to build the one large house at Cathapodal. I think I calculated that you're looking at the most productive mechanized logging industry in the Pacific Northwest in the late 1800s. It would have needed its entire supply of logs for months just to build that one house. I hope that puts in perspective just what a fantastically large effort it must have been to take place with no labor animals like horses and oxen and stuff, no mechanized equipment, and not even steel tools. And yet this industry generated millions upon millions of board feet of lumber to construct these gargantuan houses. And think about the wealth of an individual that could finance the construction, or a family that could finance the construction of these enormous monumental pieces of architecture, much less the labor it would take to transport a 6-ton tree to act as a singular roof beam in one of these houses. And this gets us back to, why do archaeologists care about this stuff? Because it's not just that bigger equals cooler. To some extent, it doesn't matter how big something is. We really care just how much effort went into doing it. And so that's why when we look at the large scale of some of these things, it provides really key insights into understanding what was the size of labor force available to be conscripted to do this. And when we look at what was built at scale, was it a house like in the examples I gave here? Was it a communal structure? Was it a religious center? This tells us a huge amount about what were people choosing to spend their effort on and who it was for. So was it for individuals? Was it for families? Was it for whole communities? Was it for religious practices? And that brings us into why it's so important not to just look at the big stuff, but look at the small stuff. Like I talked about, the small houses were not the same size as the big ones, not even close. And so when we look at these size differences, both within villages and between them, it tells us a huge amount about what kind of wealth inequality was allowed to exist. And what were people choosing to spend their effort on and who it was for. So was it for individuals? Was it for families? Was it for whole communities? Was it for religious practices? When we kind of take this information together and we look at scale of architecture and the different sizes and types of architecture being built, this gives us really profound insights into understanding who in a society got to spend the surplus production. And that gets us into a whole wealth of other understanding. But that's for another episode, which I really do hope you will join us for, because I love talking about it. And I hope you love listening about it. Yeah. So please join us for the next episode, which will be coming much sooner than the last interval, which was way too long, but it was a busier winter than we expected. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great day and learn something interesting.